Does the time period of November 1st, 1955 to April 30th, 1975 mean any significance to you? Well, to many of our grandparents, it was the time of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was the longest war the U.S. was involved in, and the most unpopular war among Americans. But before we get into everything that happened, we should tell you why the war occurred.
Before the Vietnam War, France was trying to begin more trade with the countries in Asia. The French, however, were all over Vietnam trying to control them. Vietnam had enough, so they began to fight for their independence. At first, they tried to gain their independence peacefully, but the French were not having it. So, Vietnam's leader at the time, Ho, began war on September 2nd, 1945, and it continued for about 10 years when Vietnam was awarded their independence.
In order to end the war peacefully, the French and Vietnamese held a peace conference in Geneva with the help of the U.S. During this peace conference, they decided to temporarily divide Vietnam into two sections known as the North and South Vietnam. They also made up Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which gave Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam their independence. This treaty was written by Eisenhower and the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and established in September 1954.
After the peace conference, South Vietnam, now the Republic of Vietnam, was now governed by Ngo Dang Diem, along with the aid of the U.S. And North Vietnam was turning into a communist country by a communist group called the Viet Cong. In 1955, Eisenhower and the U.S. dedicated itself to turning South Vietnam into a mini USA by building up its military just like the U.S.'s. The U.S. made them ready to fight North Vietnam. South Vietnam's ruler was not free from its challenges.
October 23, 1954. Eisenhower writes to Ngo Dinh Diem. Dear Mr. President, I have been following with great interest the course of developments in Vietnam, particularly since the conclusion of the conference in Geneva. The implications of the agreement concerning Vietnam have caused grave concern regarding the future of the country, temporarily divided by an artificial military grouping, weakened by a long and exhausting war, and faced with enemies without, and by their subversive collaborators within.
Your recent request for aid to assist in the formidable project of the movement of several 100,000 loyal Vietnamese citizens away from areas which are passing under a de facto rule and political ideology which they harbor are being fulfilled. I am glad that the U.S. is able to assist in this humanitarian effort.
Diem had to deal with different groups opposing to his rule and had charges of corruption in his government. In 1956, Diem announced that the Geneva mandated election was not going to be held because he feared that a communist would win. In 1957, insurrection against Diem began to rise again, mostly from the indigenous people, and this made the U.S. pay attention even more on building the Republic of Vietnam.
In December of 1961, Kennedy wrote to Ngo Dang Diem. Partway through the letter, he wrote, "Your letter underlines what our own information has convincingly shown, that the campaign of force and terror now being waged against your people and your government is supported and directed from outside by the authorities at Hanoi.
They have thus violated the provisions of the Geneva Accords designed to ensure peace in Vietnam and to which they bound themselves in 1954. At that time, the United States, although not a party to the accords, declared that it would view any renewal of the aggression in violation to the agreements with grave concerns and as serious threatening international peace and security. We continue to maintain that view."
On February 27, 1965, word was sent to the U.S. about an aggression from the North. It reads, "The war in Vietnam is not a spontaneous and local rebellion against the established government."
Later on it says, "The people of South Vietnam have chosen to resist this threat. At their request, the United States has taken its place beside them in their defensive struggle."
In December of 1961, the Communist North Vietnam announced the start of the National Liberation Front in South Vietnam. The United States President at the time, JFK, feared that the Republic of Vietnam was the prime place for the Soviets to sponsor wars of national liberation, and he began to prepare for the worst. JFK prepared by extending Taylor's proposal for more flexible military response, and he also sent Taylor and Walter Rustow to the Republic of Vietnam to report on the situation in October of 1961. Taylor and Walter Rustow came back with saying that they needed even more assistance of all kinds, but this was not what JFK wanted to hear. However, he decided to send help anyways.
In the summer of 1963, the U.S. support of the Republic of Vietnam began to weaken due to the fact that they needed so much support and aid. So, in November of 1963, the U.S. decided to begin a coup effort by South Vietnamese generals against Diem. By this point, Diem had not been able to do much more to help South Vietnam, and they just needed a new person in office.
During the coup, Diem was murdered, and it shocked the United States. 3 weeks later, the U.S. also suffered a loss with the assassination of JFK, and the Vice President Johnson took over. JFK and Johnson were on the same page when it came to the government, so Johnson kept most of the same policies. After the extensive policy review in March of 1964, they decided that they would keep doing the same thing but even more efficiently over in Vietnam. Johnson also wanted to make the 1964 election the main priority, but the Vietnam situation by putting it on the back burner.
After the U.S. had figured out their own government situation, they decided to begin working more on the Vietnam War. By this time, the Viet Cong began to dominate the South Vietnamese government. They now controlled more than 40% of the territory and more than 50% of the population. The U.S. quickly realized that only a massive military would destroy them. On August 2, 1964, North Vietnam attacked the U.S. on USS Maddox. After this attack, the U.S. and North Vietnam began a 3-year-long airstrike battle.
After years and years of fighting, the war finally came to a close when Saigon fell on April 30th, 1975. Almost 30 years of battle had gone on, and about 2.5 million had lost their lives. The Battle of Saigon held a special purpose for the Northern troops, to capture the capital in time for their leader's birthday, and they succeeded. The Northern Vietnamese troops had encircled Saigon by April 27th, and it was decided to launch the Ho Chi Minh Campaign. This was the final assault on Saigon, and within days, the capital of South Vietnam fell.
The war had a great impact on society and produced countless forms of media around the topic. More than 750 novels, 250 films, 100 short story collections, and 1,400 personal narratives that have been published about the war in Vietnam. It is a topic that has been tackled by many and continues to be mentioned in our pop culture today.
This war changed the United States in many ways, both good and bad, pros and cons. Favorable and unfavorable outcomes came out of the Vietnam War. In the late 1960s, the 36th President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, decided to finance this major war while also running the Great Society.
The Great Society was a set of domestic programs focused on building a healthy society in the U.S. The goal was to eliminate poverty, racial injustice, provide medical care, better education, and much more.
But because of Johnson's decision to support both simultaneously, there wasn't an increase in taxes, and this caused an inflation in the 1970s. To try to avoid this, he introduced a 10% income tax surcharge to balance things out in 1969. Unfortunately, this caused greater suffering in the economy. Not only was the economy going downhill, the massive amount being spent on the war led to an increasingly unfavorable balance of trade. This led to an international monetary crisis and threatened the gold reserves in 1967 to 1968. Eventually, it became clear that the U.S. could no longer afford the war.
On August 5, 1964, President Johnson explained in a message to Congress 4 summarized points of our intentions and reasons for this war. He says, "Our policy in Southeast Asia has been consistent and unchanged since 1954. I summarize it on June 2nd in 4 simple propositions. 1. America keeps her word. Here as elsewhere, we must and shall honor our commitments. 2. The issue is the future of Southeast Asia as a whole. A threat to any nation in that region is a threat to all, and a threat to us. 3. Our purpose is peace. We have no military, political, or territorial ambitions in this area. 4. This is not just a jungle war, but a struggle for freedom on every front of human activity. Our military and economic assistance to South Vietnam and Laos in particular has the purpose of helping these countries to repel aggression and strengthen their independence."
Following his message to Congress, President Johnson addressed the American policy in Vietnam on April 7, 1965. He brought up important questions and answers. Why are these realities our concern? Why are we in South Vietnam? We are there because we have to keep a promise. Since 1954, every American president had offered to support the people of South Vietnam. We had helped to build, and we have helped to defend. Thus, over many years, we have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence. And I intend to keep that promise. To dishonor that pledge, to abandon this small and brave nation to its enemies, and to the terror that must follow, would be an unforgivable wrong. These messages from the president show how determined the U.S. was when it came to succeeding in this war.
The Vietnam War proved fruitless for the U.S. and its allies. 60,000 Americans lost their lives and over 2 million Vietnamese had fought to the death as well. Many are traumatized, many are distraught, and many are grateful. To this day, the remaining veterans recount their tales in battle.
Alan J. Adrian of South Dakota says, "My experience there has stayed with me for the rest of my life. I believe I have come to terms with the war and have used this in a positive manner. I am proud to have served in Vietnam. There are very few Americans and very few servicemen who have served in a combat zone and realized this experience. Thank you."
The Vietnam War will forever be engraved in the minds of our veterans and citizens who lived in that time. A testimony was made to the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations on April 23, 1971, just a few years before the war would end. The testimony's closing included these words:
"We wish that a merciful God could wipe away our own memories of that service as easily as this administration has wiped away their memories of us. But all that they have done, and all that they can do by this denial, is to make more clear than ever our own determination to undertake our last mission, to search out and destroy the last vengeance of the barbaric war, to pacify our own hearts, to conquer the hate and fear that has driven this country these last 10 years and more."
And so when 30 years from now our brothers go down the street without a leg, without an arm or a face, and small boys ask why, we will be able to say Vietnam, and not mean a desert, not a filthy, obscene memory, but mean instead where America finally turned and where soldiers like us helped in the turning.